I will pass on the reins now to Stuart.
Thanks, Ash. What I will just start with, if anybody's got any questions at any point, just put them in the chat, or I'll take questions at the end. And I'm hoping this shouldn't take more than a couple of hours. No, in all seriousness, it should be about 20 minutes, and I am happy to sort of share the scars, shall we say, of owning a business. So for those that don't know me, Stuart Mckean, and I'm going to just literally rattle through some slides, and those that know me can be amused at some of the pictures. So my background before business was the military. I, like a lot of others, joined at 16 and joined the infantry because there wasn't really much choice at that time with my education, which was pretty lacking. So I basically joined the Gloucestershire Regiment, and 1983 was when I joined, and I stayed with them for a good 8 years before I thought, yeah, time to move on. And I think what I would say, it's certainly formative in my life of that early career. I think it starts you off and gives you some direction, which certainly in my time in life, I definitely needed it. And then I left the Gloucesters and went to the Army Air Corps, managed to pass a Army pilot's course. And at the end of that, even though I did manage to fall off my push bike and break my elbow, I managed to pass that, and then quickly went straight off that and converted onto Lynx helicopters and spent the rest of my military career in the Army Air Corps. I often joke now that I work for a living because that really wasn't working at the time. But yes, I can't say it was a challenging environment to be in the aviation world, but certainly great fun and thoroughly enjoyed it. I finished off my career with 2 ground tours. One was with the RAF at the Air Warfare Centre, talking about electronic warfare, and then finally looking after an IT system, funny old thing, at Secret, linked with aviation. So that was sort of before business. But once I then decided that I was going to leave the military, it was then before 923 I had a business, a couple of businesses in fact, and some of them were mainly all along the water and being on the corporate hospitality side of life. And that's really where I first got into business proper, if you like, after the military. What I would say is I certainly learned some lessons, and it didn't go as planned, that's for sure. And whilst it's easy to blame the banking crisis, that certainly had an impact, but the model wasn't quite right. And the model really was around representing Olympic athletes, raising sponsorship money for the athletes, and then marrying the return on investment with the sponsor with corporate hospitality on the water with the Olympians. And that with some training stuff that we used to do. That was the sort of first foot in the door with business. I wouldn't say I'm happy to say, but what I can say is it didn't go as planned. And back in 2011, I was left with 3 options. And those 3 options were really quite easy. One was rejoin the army, if they'd have had me, as somebody reminded me the other day. 2 was get a job, proper job, as I think my wife quoted, or 3, which was to start a company again. But what I chose to do this time was really have a think about what my skills were and what I knew about. And whilst I'm no expert, and I'm certainly not an engineer, and I can't write code in any way, shape or form, what I can do is be an end user. And that's fundamentally what most military people are. They're end users. So this was at the time, 2011, the first iPad had just been released. The iPhones had been out for a while, but we set up with a mobility focus. And ironically, the first client we ended up with, or that I worked on, was the Army Air Corps, which was an electronic flight bags into the back of helicopters. That then went to our sort of first main contract, which was the Air Force, which is around the use of electronic devices in aircraft. And that's really where 923 got started. I will say that we had some seed funding to start with. That seemed funding didn't quite work out after a year, and I bought my first partner out. But we started with an ethos around end users, and enabling end users is still the same ethos today. That's exactly what we do. Whilst we've dropped some of the mobility focus, enabling end users is exactly what we look to do today as we did 10 years ago. So that's really where the business started. And I've, for those that know me, I have a few Apple products. I'm quite a fan of the Apple culture, shall we say. But what I would pick up on first of all is the graphs on the right. I can really tell you that the graph on the right, the reality one, you wouldn't believe how close that is to our reality as a company. I mean, seriously close. We went down that big dip at the start in year 3, and we've sort of managed to climb ourselves back all the way up along the way in 10 years. And a lot of people think that it's this great, you just grow, you start a company and it just grows. The reality is so far different. And until you've rung up HMRC because you can't pay VAT, or you can't pay your corporation tax, and you can't do payroll, all these sort of things of running a business are the realities. And I would, Steve Jobs quote there, yeah, you need a passion, but to do it over a sustained period of time is really difficult. And I think a lot of people forget that. And I would put my hand on the heart and say, the single hardest thing I've ever done in my life is try and grow a business. It is very hard. And it's relentless. So it really is tough. And I know when we got asked some questions recently, 20% of businesses fail in the first years, and 60% will go bust in the first 3 years. So we were quite lucky that we very early on, I bought my first partner out, and then we were invested in by a US company. And this is, as it happens, a US military helicopter pilot, Ed Jessen, who is still our chairman today and was instrumental in investing in 923 in the early days. And without his support, continued support and guidance, I don't think we'd still be here today. So without question, it's tough, and you need that support. So that journey, that journey really, some of my favorite sayings is clarity of focus, having the focus on what you do and where you do it. We're a fan of public sector, and they're not our only client base, but certainly regulated and compliant is our market space. And it is a journey, and working out what you do and your value proposition takes actually quite a long time, and to distill it down into small chunks that you can put on the back of a beer mat is really difficult, but it's so critical to that journey and that growth. You've got to have the focus, and that clarity of focus. And I put the sort of certificates, if you like, underneath there. I think it's very important to sort of state having the structure and the processes in place is critical. We very early days became ISO 9001 because it was a certificate that we wanted to potentially win some business. And it wasn't until a few years later that we actually really started understanding what ISO means and those certificates. And we do them not to get a certificate, we do them to actually show that we know what we're talking about, and they help us to run the business. And that's the critical part of understanding your structure and your processes and how to grow a business. So being able to grow is because we have the right structure and the right processes in place. What I would say, though, that journey, we have definitely had a few issues along the way, back to my reality curve, and it's not been easy. And 10 years goes in a flash. But the key, which I'm going to come on to in more detail, of the business and the clarity of that journey is around people. And I'm going to touch on that in a bit more detail. And I've sort of tried to bullet point a few lessons. Those that do know me will be sick of hearing this, but business is fundamentally easy. Business should have money coming in and it has money going out and it has people. And the reality of any business is you should have more money coming in than's going out. It isn't rocket science. It is slightly complicated, of course, and accountants are there for a reason, but it's fundamentally you should be earning more than's going out. And people, and I'm going to come on to people in a minute and touch on them in a bit more detail. What I will say though, as a business owner, it's left some scars, and it certainly has some stress and some mental problems. And I think the best way I describe it is business has some massive highs. I mean, truly massive highs where you get the right team in place, you deliver something, you win a contract. There's lots of highs in a business, and some of them are truly massive, and it's great. The problem with massive highs are massive lows, and massive lows really are quite painful. And the key is to try and level it out so that it's not as painful both ends of the spectrum. But that does leave some scars, and it's something that I think you've got to be able to cope with as a business owner. And a lot of people don't necessarily talk about what business is truly like. Everyone thinks you're going to be a unicorn and you're going to be the next Google, etc., when the reality is so far removed from it. I think one of the other structure things we got wrong was we tried to be too big too soon. We recruited lots of people. We had far too many staff, big office, all the wrong things we did. And that was definitely a learning curve. But it was something, I'm just going to jump ahead to the fail fast. One of the things we did very quickly was downsize our offices and downsize our people to make it actually so that we fitted. So failing fast is absolutely critical, and knowing when to pull the plug on something, whether it's the size of your office or the service you're offering, you've got to be able to do it quickly. And that means really understanding that it always takes longer. Time is something that if you think it's going to take you 3 months, I can assure you it'll take you 9. It just always takes longer. And it's just a fact. And the sooner you can get used to that, understand that, and fail quickly and have that agility and that ability to change direction quickly, the better it'll be. The final point up on there is having a mentor or a coach, and they are very different beasts, or just business owners. And one of the things I've certainly done over the years is engage with other business owners and like-minded individuals, because having that network of others that have been through it, know what you're going through, it is truly valuable. And I'm a member of a couple of organizations. TrustX is one I'm in particular, that over the last couple of years has been invaluable, particularly during the pandemic. Having other businesses that just know what you're talking about, other business owners truly do add a huge amount of value, and they get it. So I think that's a really valuable lesson that I used to think was all fluff to start with, but actually is truly valuable. Coaching, mentoring, slightly different, and I'm happy to discuss both. I've tried both, but it's definitely something to consider, which sort of goes on to my final point. People. Business is all about people, whether it's partners, whether it's clients, whether it's staff. It's all about people. And one of the single most important lessons I've learned is about trust. And I think it's fair to say I was quite naive coming out of the military, where there's a very strong ethos in the military, and you generally know the types of military people. We're all pretty much the same, whichever service you were in. However, the one thing that really caught me out very early on was trust, and trusting individuals and people and what they said, when actually trust, when you lose it, is extremely hard to get back, and trust is earned. It's not something you buy. And it's made me much more averse now to trusting anybody until they've earned it. You could argue that's sad, but as a business owner, I would strongly suggest anybody that wants to run a business is you don't trust anybody until they've earned it. And it's a two-way thing, by the way. It's not just one way. And that leads me to culture. And this is another one of those fluffy things that I would have read in a business book and gone, yes. What I would say is, until you've built that team of people around you who share the same values and have the same ethos, culture isn't something you just get. You have to work and build on it, and it's about building the people. And when you get the right people, and we certainly were up at 30 plus staff early days, and actually it wasn't until we went down to, I think, 8 staff when we had to restructure, that you realize that actually having the right 8 people gives you more value and more that you can take forward, and that builds that culture because you have the right ethos and you have the right team. And that is probably one of the biggest things I've learned, is about building that culture. And I just sort of finish, if I may, on risk. I think most business, I'm not a fan of the word entrepreneur, but I think most business owners, they fundamentally have a different risk appetite. And over the years, I've had a lot of people come to me and ask when they can get their shareholding in 923. And I tend to have a stock answer, which is when you've remortgaged your house, and you've taken as much risk as I have, then you can start talk to me about having a shareholding. People want to be an entrepreneur, and it's a bit of a buzzword, when the reality is, business owners, you've got to be able to understand the risks. And I suppose one of the biggest takeaways in both my career in the military and post the military, it's all about what my risk appetite is. And I think I'm just slightly more happy to take some risks. I certainly know some people that have taken more than me, and that the reward hasn't come. And I've certainly got other people that have taken the risk and the reward has definitely come. So I think it's understanding risk and what that risk reward looks like. I think that's absolutely key to growing a business, without doubt. And my final slide, you'd be delighted to know, is really, I put the future on here and what the next 10 years looks like. What I would say is that 10 years has gone by in a flash, and there's part of me that thinks we've got great structure, we've got great people, and we're ready for growth. However, there's another part of me that says, wow, if that took 10 years, it's going to take us another 10 years to really get where I want to be. But these 3 bullet points I've taken out of our last business strategy meeting that we had as a business, where I was quite open with everybody in the business. I want to have a choice, quite simply. That risk reward is about having choice. And really what I'm looking for is, I still want to be as driven, ambitious, and still loving it, because I think I've yet to find a business owner who really doesn't love their business. And I know people talk about getting attached and it's your baby, etc. That's not quite what I mean. I mean, it's the ability to still enjoy doing what you're doing and having a purpose in life and getting out of bed every morning. That's absolutely still key to me. And I would work 7 days a week. No problem at all. But the final point really is about working with people again. I want to work with people. Not who are as talented as me, because I am the least talented person within the company, I can tell you, but they need to be as committed, and that comes back to that ethos and the culture within a business. You can't buy it, you have to grow it, and you grow it with the people. And as long as you get the like-minded people, then I want to continue working with those. Definitely been a journey, and I think any business owner would agree with me. It has its ups and downs, but I certainly wouldn't be without it. But as I say, if anybody's got any questions, I'm happy to take them. I'm happy to chat offline, and if anybody wants any mentoring or guidance or support, then that's something I always think is willing to give back, and I'm always happy to share, as I think most business owners are. They're usually very happy to share scars. So likewise, I'm happy to share my scars with anybody. So happy to take it. So Richard, morning. Would you do anything differently? Were there any pivotal moments you wished you had made a different decision? Excuse me. I think it's it's easy to, would I do anything differently? Hindsight is, I think, the most valuable thing in the world. And in hindsight, perhaps today I wouldn't do things the same, but I didn't know them at the time. So I think it's part of that learning. So I don't think I'd necessarily do anything differently. Perhaps if I was starting again, I'd use those lessons and wouldn't do it the same. And I think the pivotal moments, I don't think there was different decisions. I suppose, if anything, Richard, I'd say I wish I'd made some of those pivotal decisions earlier. Back to my fail fast thing. When we restructured, I talked about a HR, I call it a betrayal, at year 3. And that point then, we absolutely, or I absolutely buried my head in the sand, and for 6 months thought everything will be fine. And and it turns out everything wasn't going to be fine. So for 6 months I buried my head before we restructured, and we let 17 people go on one day, and we downsized the office, and we did what we needed to do to survive. I suppose what I would say is I'd wished I'd done that decision earlier as opposed to a different decision. And that was definitely a lesson. But without it, I don't think we'd have survived. So that was definitely a decision I wish I'd made sooner as opposed to a different one. Richard, can't get off mute. The technology. You were in IT, Richard, I believe. Would you say one biggest challenge? I think the biggest challenge is growth. I cannot stress enough. I think growing a business, starting one, we can all go online today. We can set up a business, drop of a hat. That's very easy to do. I think the single hardest thing is growing a business. And for that, it's hard because you need so many different elements to come together: your people, your services, your solutions, your partners. There's so many different things that you've got to get aligned that makes growth the single biggest challenge. And we're still going through it. And we're not alone. Go and look at Apple, Microsoft. They've all had their struggles over their times. So I think I definitely think this is something that we've got to consider as our hardest challenge. John, do you think there's a connection between your waterborne hobbies interest and taking that into business led to the demise of Links? Probably, John. I think I always sort of say to people, when I left in the first business, the corporate hospitality and being on the water, John in particular will know very well that some of us spent quite a lot of our military time doing the things we loved, not just flying helicopters, but also in going sailing quite a bit. When you do something professionally as a living, it isn't a hobby or an interest anymore. It becomes real. And when you've got to pay your mortgage and pay the bills, it's really quite scary, and it doesn't become fun. So taking your passion, interest, whatever you want to call it, into a business is a very different thing. And I got lots of things wrong on that business, without question, that I would rather not go through again. And they certainly, stress is the silent killer. But I do think it was taking those lessons that perhaps helped 923 to get going, learning from those lessons. But even 923's had some journey and some lessons that have been learned that I've been through. So I definitely think if you're going to do something as a hobby and as a passion, don't always think that doing it as a business is a good thing. It's very, very different. But lessons to be learned, and I hope I learned some of them. So yeah, we will see. Thanks for the comment, Michael. I think that's one of the keys for me, is that it's back to risks. Some people are willing to take the risk and some people don't want to take the risk. Some people are happy in corporate world, some people are happy working for somebody else. I think that what I would say is that when one of the darkest days was, as I say, letting 17 people go on one day, I think of the 17 odd that we let go, there was only one that really had a proper meltdown and wasn't very happy. All the others sat in front of me and said, well, I wouldn't take the risks you were taking, Stuart. And I think that's back to my risk reward comments before. I only look at things now, going back on all of my sort of career, of going, but actually I was just willing to take more of a risk. But you know, it's like when I left the infantry to go flying, I didn't deem that to be a risk, because if I'd have failed the pilot's course, and by the way, there was a very big failure rate. Getting on the course and then passing it was actually quite an achievement for most Army pilots. There's not that many of us, but the risk of failing it was why I just went back to the battalion and would just carry on. I didn't lose my job. I didn't lose my house. There's very little risk there. So actually, the risk was minimal. Certainly, as I've been in business, I've realised that risk is on another level. And when you can't pay your mortgage, and you can't pay the VAT, and you can't pay your corporation tax, and you can't pay payroll, all those little things become absolutely massive, and trust me, they add to the stress levels. So understanding the risk, I think, is an absolute critical part of a business owner's life. And I think a lot of people don't really talk about it because everyone just highlights the good things, and it's all wonderful and it's easy, and it's back to that myth line of just growth. It's not true at all, and I think most business owners would attest to that. Andy, how do you find the commercial harder and easier than the public forces background? I think what I found with sector specific is they're all sector specific, if that makes sense. I think going into defence as a good industry is something where we started. Understanding, coming from it, knowing it, thinking you know it, when actually you realise that you were just a user in the military, is very different to working with the defence organisations like DE&S and the like. So whilst you might understand part of the sector, you don't necessarily understand it all. But I think the reality of where we've ended up is that all sectors have users. But to break into those sectors, you've got to have people from those sectors that have an understanding of how it works. And that's something that's taken us a long time to realise. But on the same breath, we've recently just finished a contract that was 8 years in length with a probation company. And thankfully, I've never been on probation. It's not an area I know anything about, rehabilitation, but we know that the users were the probation officers that went out into the streets and talked to their clients, and they had a new model, and we basically delivered an IT service to them that enabled them to work. Ironically, users are the same whether you're a probation worker or a medical person or a military pilot, or you work in the financial conduct world. Doesn't matter, you're all still users. However, I think it's understanding how the sectors operate and knowing people with the connections, because back to my people point, people buy from people. Full of cliches, I'm afraid, but people do buy from people. Defence people tend to buy from other defence people. The same with policing, the same in medical. It's the same the world over. So I think I don't think they're harder or easier. I think they're all hard. I think you've just got to work out how you're going to approach them. And back to my fail fast thing, if it's not right, don't do it. Don't go there. If you're going to all of a sudden go into the NHS, you've got to weigh it all up and think long and hard if it's the right sector for you. So yeah, I don't think there's harder or easier, unfortunately. And I think, as you well know, it all goes round. It's the same. I think between all of them. There's no more questions. As I say, I'm always happy to try and give something back, and we have recorded this because there are others that have asked, who's been in touch and said they want to watch it later. I'd like to think it's about giving back, and if people do want to give something back, then I think the best thing any business owner can do is share it. And I think conversations with a few people recently around small business owners in particular, they really do work with each other, and supporting small businesses is definitely something that I'm very passionate about, and trying to help people understand the realities of owning and running a business, because I think there's far too much fluff out there of people, how great it all is. But I'm happy to share it, and if anybody wants to chat further or have a beer, I'll be very happy to do that. So I will speak to you all later. I'll sign off, and as I say, if you've got any questions for me, I'm always happy to share them. But for the moment, I'll say thanks for coming. It's much appreciated. I was glad there was more than two of us on the call. So yeah, thanks very much, and hopefully speak soon. Take care.